So hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Banat and I'm going to be talking to Katie Strang today, who is a senior writer at The Athletic and is kind enough to give us her time today. So Katie, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, just happy that it's Friday.
Me too.
So just first to get a little bit of information about your experience so far in this field. What made you get into sports journalism? Did you play sports growing up, or what drew you to it?
I did. I did play sports growing up and probably realized that I was not going to make it as like a college or a professional athlete. So wanted to try to find a career that would keep me in sports in some way, shape, or form. And so from a pretty early age, I decided that I wanted to go into sports writing. And then I did like a one-day internship with the sports editor of my local newspaper when I was in sixth grade, and loved it. Like, thought it was really great and have sort of focused on that ever since.
That's awesome. So wow, you started off pretty early then. And so a little bit about your career path up to this point. I know that you had worked for ESPN, now you're at The Athletic.
Yep. So we were saying a little bit earlier, my first job out of college, I worked for Newsday as a general assignment sports reporter. I started actually as an intern and then got hired in. And then I gradually worked my way up to becoming a beat writer. I covered the New York Islanders for a couple of years, went to ESPN, covered hockey for ESPN, and then covered a little bit of baseball. And sort of life happened in between. I got married, I had a kid, and not long after I came back to work after my first daughter, I got a call from a former coworker who wanted me to jump ship to The Athletic, and that was about 4 years ago today.
Awesome. So it seems like you're pretty happy there.
Very much so. Very much so.
That's awesome. So to talk a little bit about like the sports media industry in general and kind of being a woman in a predominantly male field, did you feel like it was harder for you to land jobs in this industry because you're a woman?
No, I don't think it was harder to land jobs, but I would say in some of my jobs, I think I felt like I had to sort of over deliver in terms of like, you know, perform to a higher degree than maybe some of my male peers at times, just to be like the baseline of being taken seriously and to be given opportunities and pipelines for advancement.
Right.
But I also like, especially when I was early in my career, I was lucky that I started my career in New York. There were a lot of women in very prominent roles in New York when I was starting out, and they were always really gracious and kind about helping other young women on the way up.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that, definitely played a major role for me in terms of like helping my career trajectory and always knowing that I had people to lean on and to ask for advice and stuff like that. So, yes, there were definitely some sort of baked in challenges, but I also think like I encountered a lot of really wonderful allies and mentors along the way too.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely encouraging to have people kind of lead the way. And as you kind of mentioned, so in your experience, like while you were in the workplace, kind of wanted to just ask if you've experienced instances where you felt like there was sexism or there was microaggressions that took place.
Yeah, definitely. I've over the past 3 or 4 months, I've been like writing a series of stories about sexual harassment in predominantly in Major League Baseball. And I think part of the reason that myself and my co-writer have been able to like tackle these stories pretty aggressively is because we've gone through it, right? And so when we talk to women about their experiences, they know we get it. That we've been through it. Like I always tell like younger women coming up to the business, like if you ever want to, call me or text me or reach out about any issues that you're having, don't feel like embarrassed, because I guarantee you any situation that you've been through, I have been through, or a friend of mine has been through, like all of us that have lasted as long as we have in this business have like some crazy stories to show for it. And that's unfortunate, but it, you know, has also like probably shaped us as reporters and as like, you know, female professionals in this field, and hopefully, you know, reinforce, you know, the idea of why it's important to help younger women on the way up too.
For sure. And that's awesome that you do that. I did hear you mention in the interview kind of how you like to pay it forward, which is great, which brings us here today, because it had kind of trouble getting people for my podcast. So I was supposed to have 2 guests, but I'm super happy that I have you here. So also wanted to just ask, like on that same topic, if you feel like women are kind of in the sports media are generally assigned like the less hard-hitting stories, while men are kind of given the more major topics to report on.
Totally. You know, I remember when I was an intern at Newsday when I was first starting, I think they asked me within like the first couple of months to do a story, like go around the Giants locker room and ask players about Harry Potter. Like it was around the time that like one of the books was released or one of the movies was released, so they wanted me to like do a Harry Potter themed story. And I remember saying like, no, I'm not going to do it, because like, one, you probably wouldn't ask a male coworker to do it. And, or even if you would, like, this is just not how I want to establish my reputation as like someone that like asks about fluff.
Right.
Now, I probably would have an easier time like doing like a fun fluffy story now, but only because like my calling card now is like I do like deep dive investigative pieces, so I feel like I've earned a little bit of like levity or like some puppies and rainbows puff pieces like to mix in here and there as palate cleansers. But I didn't feel like I had that reputation at the time, and I felt like it would have just like made me appear as someone that wasn't truly, you know, in it for the right reasons or interested in in-depth reporting, which I really was. Right. I think that's I actually think that's a big reason why to some degree I sought out investigative reporting within my work, because I felt like it was like you can almost sort of like insulate yourself from criticism about being like, you know, only pursuing fluff stories or positive pieces. Like if you're doing like really hard-hitting sort of provocative, you know, investigative journalism, like people aren't going to accuse you of that. People might not like you, but they're going to like you based on the merits of your reporting, and not like, you know, judge you based on gender,
Sure.
based on the content that you're delivering.
For sure. That's a great example. So I'm glad I asked you that question, because that's like kind of bizarre that they asked you to interview them about Harry Potter.
You know what? They asked me, at one point they asked me about compiling a list of like the 10 hottest New York athletes too, I remember. And I was like, that's going to be a hard no for me. Absolutely not.
A hard no, for sure. Yeah, that's ridiculous that they would even ask you that. But on the topic of also going into the locker rooms, I was also going to ask, because I had seen some other female sports journalists mention this, if you feel like you have less access to players and coaches as a woman than men do.
No, I don't.
That's good.
And well, I guess this is sort of like let me give a 2-pronged answer. Like in sort of like the general access way, no. Especially like starting in New York, where all 9 professional teams that I covered are like, it's a saturated media market, and because of that, no one bats an eye at a women in the clubhouse. It's a very highly professionalized corporate setting. So like I rarely had any issues there. I would say like the more issues I ever ran into were at the very like amateur minor league levels of teams that I covered. But I will say this, like, you know, in some ways, I think there were probably times where players would be more likely to talk to me as a woman. For example, like when I was pregnant, like I found that really easy, right? Like pretty hard for a player to like deny that you're a human being when you're carrying, like you are sustaining life.
Yeah.
and it's very physically obvious, right? And so like, players would always ask how I was feeling or tell me about like their wives' pregnancies or their birth stories or their kids. And that was a really great way for me to make sort of genuine human connections beyond just the sports. But I will say the one part that, I know has been an issue in the past for me to probably a more minor degree, but I know it has become an issue for a lot of other women in the field is like, when you cover a beat or are really entrenched on a sport and you're trying to cultivate sources and you ask for like people's numbers, whether it's players, agents, executives, that's something that like men don't really have to think twice about besides just the general awkwardness of doing that. But it's a bit more fraught for women because we have to also like kind of modulate these requests and calculate for ourselves, like, is this person going to think if I ask for their number that I'm doing it for the wrong reasons, or if there's something I want other than information or to develop a professional relationship. I haven't dealt with that a ton, especially probably the last 4 or 5 years of my career, just because I feel like I think I have pretty strong relationships in the business and a pretty strong like reputation based on my work. And so I think people generally don't test the waters, right? But I that was definitely something I dealt with more as a younger reporter, more in sports where I didn't have a strong reputation, and when I was in sort of unfamiliar environments.
Right. Totally understand that. And I know you've spoken a little bit about like being frustrated with the image of women that's perpetuated in the hockey world and other sports media, especially in regards to the situation with Mike Mulberry calling women a disruption at hockey games. Kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this image of women that's portrayed in the sports industry, and how you would describe that image, and if comments like Mulberry's are kind of a regular thing in this industry.
I mean, they are from him, which is the problem. And that's like, why I wrote that column is I just feel like we were all sort of like rolling our eyes, like, well, that's Mike, and maybe not taking a step back to say like, wow, that's really fucked up that we all just kind of like accept this as, the standard, which it shouldn't be, and it's truly not. And I don't think it is among most men actually in hockey. I don't think most men think that way. I don't think most players think that way, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of why I wrote that story, or that column rather. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there are a lot of different ways that women can be marginalized by people who aren't really doing a great job of thinking in sort of more nuanced, sophisticated lenses. I think a lot of times the way that women are written about is like a very derivative or proximal way. So you talk about women as like wives or daughters or their relation to, hockey players, right? Versus like, I think that there is going to be a huge movement towards covering more women's sports and like covering women as athletes, tremendous athletes in their own right, or I think we will see more women as scouts, more women as executives, more women in coaching positions. So I think as that happens, I think the perceptions about women and the way that we talk and write about them will change.
Right, kind of like discussing women more as the main characters, not their relation, like you said, as wives and daughters. I totally understand what you're saying with that. And so I also wanted to just talk a little bit about the investigative topics in sports that you cover. So I know you cover a lot of crucial social justice issues that go on in the sports world, which I think is super important. What would you say to someone who would tell you to just stick to sports?
Yeah, I mean, that's like become such a sort of a caricature of a catchphrase that it's like almost not even worth dignifying with the response, because I mean, the reality is like sports intersects with like social issues.
Sure.
I mean, every single day, right? Whether it be like politics or, inclusivity, social justice movements, domestic violence, drug use, mental health, sexual abuse. Sports are not immune from any of that. And so I think if you want to be good at your job and write about sports in a really like nuanced, sophisticated way, you better be able to tackle those important issues that, like, cross-sect, I guess, all segments of society. Yeah.
Right, most definitely. And I know you cover a lot of sexual abuse issues, which again I think is super important that over the past few years that there's been more light shed on those things. And what is your advice on getting through those interviews about sensitive topics that might kind of feel uncomfortable to talk about, like when you're speaking to victims of sexual assault?
Yeah, I mean, I think just remember that like trauma is a really complicated thing, and it has like really tangible physiological effects beyond just emotional effects. So, sometimes victims of trauma remember things in a lot non-linear fashion. Sometimes they will only recover fragments of memory. Sometimes they'll remember like very small, seemingly inconsequential things, and will have a hard time recalling, bigger, more thematic concepts. So like to be sort of mindful about the granular effects of trauma, and then also just like from the macro perspective that, I always try to remember like this is not my story to tell, and like this person is being extremely vulnerable and taking a leap of faith by sharing that with me, right? And it's a very personal, painful, private trauma that I need to treat with like dignity and respect.
For sure, I think that's a really good way to handle it. And I know you wrote a little bit about the moment that the Me Too movement hit the sports world, which I think is really crucial that those things intertwine because of all the issues and the issues of sexual misconduct that do go on in that world. What was it like to experience that when the Me Too movement came to sports?
It's interesting. Like, I don't even know if we really have had the like full Me Too reckoning in sports. Like, I feel like we've gotten it in kind of like bits and spurts, which has been kind of odd to me because I do think that type of behavior is like prevalent in sports as in any other like major industry that has gone through this reckoning, like entertainment and stuff. So it's been interesting that I almost feel like it's been a little bit like delayed. We've seen a little bit of it like recently, I guess, I'm sort of biased, but like within our own reporting, like we've been doing stuff on sexual harassment.
Mhm.
And I think the more you write about it critically, the more people will read that and say, hey, these are people that are, willing to take on this topic. And so you're more likely to get people to come out of the woodwork and share things with you. And I hope that, that sort of shifts what people's perceptions of like what is acceptable and what is not in the workplace, and what has become normalized and what should not become normalized. And so, I think we're like really maybe only at the beginning.
Right, for sure. There's still a long way to go in terms of that. And on the topic of sexual harassment, I was gonna mention the situation. It seems like when there are sexual harassment allegations towards men in authoritative positions, such as the recent allegations towards Mickey Callaway and Jared Porter from the Mets, it seems like these men usually kind of get away with it with just a warning. But now that this particular incident has been brought to the media's attention, do you feel like the MLB is taking the proper steps to reform their workplace culture?
I think they're trying. I think they're like initiating a lot of efforts with the intent to get at the root of that. But the reality is like a lot of the changes got to come from the attitudes and organizational philosophies from within. So like it's going to take a lot more, men being allies to women in the workplace. I think it's going to require a lot of people in positions of power and authority to like really truly listen and understand what's taking place within their organizations, and be willing to embrace some constructive criticism, and maybe challenge some long held beliefs and schools of thought about what is and what is not acceptable. So I think it'll require attitudes changing at a very micro level before we see any macro level change.
Right. Deeper institutional changes, definitely that have to be made. And kind of just broader version of that question, just how you think that the sports industry could do better to prevent sexism and make it more gender equal in sports media.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably starts with like hiring practices, like within sports media and also like within like the sports world in general. Like, I think the more diverse and inclusive your workforce is, you know, sort of the better it is suited to sort of like sustain levels of diversity and inclusivity and equity. Um, I think if you have more women in positions of authority and with decision-making roles, I think you'll see attitudes, you know, change, and I think see sort of a more open workplace and a safer workplace for women. So I think to start there is a big step.
Absolutely. And kind of to finish up, just bringing it back to you a little bit. I know you had mentioned in an interview with Julie Banks that you, or a podcast, I mean, that you remember the feeling of being young and having like a lot of catching up to do, which is exactly how I feel, because I didn't do journalism as an undergrad. I actually did PR, ended up trying to get a job in that, not working out. And now I'm kind of just taking on journalism in grad school. And I kind of feel like it's a little bit of an uphill battle. I do feel like I have a lot of catching up to do. So I just wanted to know like what advice you would have for a young female journalist like myself who's trying to break into the industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say like do whatever really moves you. So like pursue things that you're passionate about. So for me, I didn't even realize till like kind of later in my career that investigative stuff was what I wanted to do. And you know, don't be afraid of like not following a tight like timeline or trajectory. Invariably, like your life and lived experiences will serve you as a reporter in terms of like, you know, making you more curious about the world or making you better prepared to speak to people about certain issues that, you know, it's one of the wonderful things about journalism is like it requires you to have a tremendous amount of versatility. And so the more well-rounded that you can be and become, and like the more you seek out in terms of like learning new things and trying new things, actually the more better suited you will be to any journalism job, because it's so much about like versatility, adaptivity, and being able to learn things on the fly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for that advice. And yeah, I was going to also ask like kind of what made you move towards investigative journalism. Was there one story that was like very memorable that you were like, this is my call?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first like big investigative foray for me was I covered the Larry Nassar trial.
I read a little bit of
Or
that.
the case rather. And largely because like it was in my backyard. I was a competitive gymnast growing up. I went to Michigan State. So like there was a lot of elements about that like I thought, oh, this is something that I think I would like covering. And I don't know if I would say that I liked covering it, but it was probably the most like impactful experience of my career, in that I felt very purpose driven when I was covering it. And I was, you know, I felt like my level of emotional investment in that coverage was such that I felt like the quality of my content was so much greater as a result. And so it took a lot more out of me. But I also felt really proud of the work that I did. And I felt like, you know, that it had impact also. And then I discovered that that was something that I felt like maybe was a little bit lacking for me previously. And that's something I wanted to focus in on moving forward. So that was a big game changer for me in terms of a perspective shift about what I felt like I really wanted and needed out of my career.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree. I feel like your passion is shown through your work, just from reading your articles and also from my own experience a bit, that when you are really passionate about a topic, like the content is kind of just bound to come out better, like you said. So,
Totally.
Just kind of to finish up, I just wanted to see, like, where do you kind of see yourself in 5-10 years from now? Do you want to continue covering sports and investigative stories in that realm, or are there any other beats that you would like to move towards?
Probably not within sports. Like, I mean, it's hard for me to envision doing anything but investigative work just because I like it so much. But there are certainly more tools I'd like to add to my tool belt. Like, like to do more podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to probably experiment with different methods of like narrative storytelling. I'd like to get a little bit better in terms of financial reporting, just because it's so important in any sort of sports reporting, but also investigative reporting. Um, and to incorporate data probably more into my work, I think would be something that I would like to get better at in the next few years.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Alrighty. That pretty much concludes everything. You gave me tons of helpful information, so thank you so
Good.
much.
Of course. I'm happy. Feel free to contact me anytime, and I'm happy to be a sounding board.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to end. This is Stephanie Banat and Katie Strang signing off.